Imagine you are standing on a crowded city street and someone collapses in front of you. Not a stumble, a full collapse. They are on the ground, not moving, and they need help right now. There are 40 other people around you. And here is what research has shown, again and again, with a consistency that should disturb you. The more people who witness that moment, the less likely any single one of them is to help, including you. That isn't a cynical guess about human nature. It's one of the most replicated findings in the history of social psychology, and the mechanism behind it is far stranger than indifference. Most people hear this and assume the explanation is moral failure, selfishness, cowardice, a world full of people who simply don't care enough. That explanation feels satisfying because it gives you somewhere to put the blame. It's also almost entirely wrong. What actually happens in that moment has very little to do with whether people care, and almost everything to do with how a social brain processes uncertainty when surrounded by other social brains doing the same thing. To understand it, you have to go back to a Friday night in 1964. A young woman named Kitty Genovese was attacked outside her apartment building in Queens, New York. She was stabbed twice, managed to cry out, and her attacker fled when neighbors turned on lights. Then the attacker came back, and came back again. By the time it was over, she had been killed. Reports at the time claimed 38 neighbors had witnessed some part of the attack without calling the police. The actual details, as later researchers noted, were more complicated than the newspaper account suggested. But the story galvanized two psychologists named John Darley and Bib Latané into designing one of the most important experiments in the history of their field. They brought people into a room and told them they would be participating in a discussion about college life, conducted over an intercom to preserve anonymity. While the participant was alone in their cubicle, a voice over the intercom began having what sounded like a seizure, gasping, choking, asking for help. Then silence. When the participant believed they were the only other person listening, about 85% of them left the room to get help within the first minute. When they believed there were 5 other people listening too, that number dropped to 31%. Same voice, same sounds, same emergency. The crowd didn't make people more heroic. It made them less. What is actually happening in those extra seconds of hesitation? 2 things, operating simultaneously, and both of them are rooted in the social logic that governs almost everything your brain does in public. The first is what Darley and Latané called diffusion of responsibility. In a genuine emergency, when you are alone, the moral weight of the situation falls entirely on you. If you don't act, someone may die, and you will have failed to prevent it. That weight is heavy and immediate. But when you are surrounded by other people, that weight distributes itself across the group. Not consciously, not deliberately, but automatically. Each person in the crowd experiences themselves as one of many potential responders, which means no single person feels fully responsible for the outcome. The responsibility becomes diffuse, like heat spreading across a surface, and no single point gets hot enough to trigger action. The second mechanism is more subtle and in some ways more revealing. It's called pluralistic ignorance. In an ambiguous situation, you don't only look at the situation itself. You look at how other people are responding to the situation, to figure out how serious it actually is. If no one around you looks alarmed, you take that as information. You conclude that perhaps it isn't an emergency after all, that maybe the person who fell is drunk or acting or already being helped by someone out of sight. You're running a rational calculation on the social signals around you, trying to read the room before you commit to a response that might turn out to be embarrassing or unnecessary. Here's the trap. Every person in the crowd is doing the same thing at the same time. Every person is looking at every other person's calm face to decide whether to be alarmed, and every other person is also keeping their face calm while privately looking around for cues. The crowd produces a collective stillness that no individual member actually feels, and that stillness is then read by everyone else as evidence that there's no emergency. The group has manufactured a false consensus out of individual uncertainty, and that consensus can hold even while someone on the ground in front of them is dying. Bib Latané and John Darley formalized this in their bystander effect research throughout the late 1960s, and the replication record since then has been remarkably consistent. The effect doesn't disappear when people are told about it. It weakens slightly, but the underlying processes are fast enough and automatic enough that knowing about them is not sufficient to fully override them. Your brain is doing something older and faster than intellectual awareness. There's one specific thing that breaks the effect almost every time, and it isn't bravery. It isn't moral clarity. It isn't a better character. It's direct assignment of responsibility. In multiple follow-up studies, when a victim made eye contact with one specific person in a crowd and said, "You, in the blue jacket, call an ambulance," that person almost always helped immediately. The diffusion of responsibility collapsed the instant it became personal. The pluralistic ignorance broke the instant one person stopped using the crowd as a reference point and started acting. And once one person moved, others typically followed. The crowd didn't lack the capacity to help. It lacked the social trigger that makes helping feel like the individual's specific job. This is important to understand about yourself, not as abstract psychology, but as practical self-knowledge. If you are ever in a medical emergency, you are in the most danger not when you are alone, but when you are surrounded by a crowd of people who don't know each other. The very presence of witnesses makes the response slower, not faster. And if you are ever the person who needs to help, the most effective thing you can do is not simply decide to be a better person than the research suggests. It's to break the diffusion deliberately, point at someone, assign them a task, make the responsibility specific and individual, and watch the crowd come to life. What the bystander effect reveals is something important about social brains in general. The same instinct that makes you look to others for cues about how to behave, which is an ancient, deeply adaptive social skill, can become a trap in exactly the situations where speed matters most. The crowd isn't full of indifferent people. It's full of people doing what social creatures do, reading each other, waiting for confirmation, deferring to the apparent consensus. In ordinary life, that keeps you from overreacting to false alarms. In genuine emergencies, it can kill you. You are not more selfish than you think. You are more social than you realize. And sometimes those two things lead to the same outcome. Imagine you are standing on a crowded city street and someone collapses in front of you. Now you know what is happening in that moment, and you know the one thing that cuts through it. Don't look at the crowd. Point at a person. Make it specific. Make it theirs. That is the difference the research has found again and again between the crowd that froze and the crowd that moved.